In 1993, a Chinese container ship called the Milky Way, or Yinhe in Chinese, was on a routine delivery trip to the Middle East. The CIA decided it was probably delivering weapons of mass destruction to Iran and suggested the cargo was chemical weapons, ingredients of mustard gas and nerve gas. So the United States ordered the ship, a civilian vessel, to turn around and return to China. The sailor said the accusations were not true. The Chinese government offered to allow a third-party inspection, but the US sent fighter jets and warships to harass the ship and force it off course. The US then disabled the ship's GPS system so that it could no longer safely navigate. The sailors trying to fulfill their assignment were thwarted by a group from the other side of the world for no reason. Then things got worse. The US ordered ports around the region to refuse to allow it to dock anywhere. The sailors were stuck in the ocean for more than 20 days until they ran out of supplies. Dying of thirst in the middle of the sea. What a way to go. Now let's just press pause for a second. You notice something? The US is operating as if it runs the world and can do anything it likes to anyone in the world, anytime it likes, right? What legal power does it have to force a Chinese ship to go home, or to force ports of other countries to do its bidding? None at all. But it's strong and rich and good at coercion. It's done this for decades. It does the same thing today. Now, the New York Times coverage is a textbook example of journalists pretending to report the news while actually just sharing their opinions. The paper's Nicholas Kristof wrote, "American officials may fear that Chinese and local officials would unload the cargo of chemicals and then cheerfully announce that the ship contained nothing more than stuffed pandas." Note that Kristof doesn't say that a deception involving stuffed pandas was what American officials feared. He reported that American officials may fear that such a deception would take place. In other words, he just made it up. Kristof goes on to express puzzlement that the Chinese sailors don't simply follow the orders given by the Americans. The ship could presumably return to China and continue to protest its innocence, he wrote. He finds it a mystery that China should publicly dare to complain about their mistreatment. One of the mysteries at this stage is why China chose to publicize the matter at all, given that some people are likely to assume the worst of Beijing. Now just think about that for a moment. The US unfairly uses military power and unfairly coerces innocent third parties to bring misery to innocent sailors, and Kristof is puzzled that they should complain about it. From his point of view, pointing out that Chinese people are being mistreated is a bad idea because some people are likely to assume the worst of Beijing, he writes. He's admitting that the truth is not the issue because many people just assume that whatever happens, it's the Chinese to blame. Thanks to mainstream media journalists exactly like himself. Eventually, the United Arab Emirates was allowed to dispatch a ship carrying fresh water, vegetables and fruit, which they delivered to the desperate Chinese sailors. The Milky Way, or Yinhe, was eventually allowed to dock, and various teams of inspectors went on board. They found no chemical weapons, no weapons of any kind, nothing in the least bit dodgy. The sailors, it transpired, had been telling the truth from day one. Now, American officials refused to apologise for the incident and brushed aside claims that they should pay compensation to the individuals or the company. Some US officials said the whole thing was clearly the fault of the Chinese, who had tricked everyone with their dastardly strategy of telling the truth. Incidentally, this was the same scenario we saw 10 years later in 2003 in Iraq. The CIA said Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein said no, they didn't. The US led an invasion which caused countless deaths and injuries. It turned out that the weapons didn't exist. US politicians said Saddam had tricked them by unexpectedly telling the truth. It was his fault. Now back to our story. Okay, right. Let's go back to 1993. Now the desperate sailors now have some fruit, they have some water. US politicians are blaming the Chinese for the whole international incident over the Yinhe ship, saying the Chinese had set up a sting operation to humiliate the CIA. What did the Chinese government do in retaliation? Well, I'll tell you. President Jiang Zemin sent a strong message to the United States. It said that there was a lesson to be learned from this incident. China and the US should steer away from confrontation and expand cooperation so as to avoid such trouble in future. Yeah, that's what it said. Not what you expect from cartoon villains, is it? The Chinese government took the opportunity to improve relations between China and the US. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, well, that's the Chinese version of events. The Western version of the story will be very different. Well, it's not. The story, the way I told it to you, is the Western academic summary of the tale. Now, here's what we learn from this. Now, the Americans got this one very wrong and the Chinese behaved correctly. Sometimes it's the other way around, I'm sure. Neither of these two countries has governments which are all good or all bad. But here's the important thing. Allegations of wrongdoing by the Chinese are recycled endlessly, even after they've been totally debunked. At the same time, stories like this one about the Yinhe, which show the Chinese being peaceable and truthful and positive, and the US causing unnecessary conflict on the other side of the world, those stories disappear at lightning speed. They don't fit the good guy, bad guy narrative. This teaches us the importance of having a little healthy skepticism whenever you read negative reports about the places designated as enemies by the United States. The Chinese are on that list, and even the little community known as Hong Kong is there. We Hong Kongers have our own listing as enemies of the United States. I know, right? So, yes, wherever you live, you will be fed constant negative stories about the Chinese, about the Iranians, about Hong Kong, other communities, Russia. You know, read them if you wish, but keep in mind the actions and words of Jiang Zemin. Instead of fighting back by fighting back, break the cycle of conflict. As Jiang said, choose to avoid confrontation and embrace cooperation, because that is the better path. Peace.